Oh, okay. All right, I think we're ready to start here. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I just want to remind everyone that you can post questions at any time throughout the YouTube chat, and Adin will address them at the end of the presentation. So Duradin is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science. Her major and minor fields are international relations and comparative politics, respectively. Her dissertation examines the mobilization of individuals within the radical right-wing groups in Canada through a gendered lens. She is a SSHRC CGS doctoral scholar, a junior affiliate at the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security and Society, and a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Along with her PhD studies, she has completed multiple work terms with the federal departments such as Public Safety Canada, Global Affairs Canada, and the Department of National Defense. Her goal is to bridge the academic policy divide by gaining experience in both domains. Take it away, Adin.
Thank you so much, Brandon, and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for taking the time. So I will just quickly share my screen. So as Brandon mentioned, for my PhD dissertation, I'm studying individuals who join radical right-wing groups and movement in Canada. However, for the talk today, I am going to focus on some of the ethical issues that I encountered from the very beginning of my research project to being in the field to now that I'm writing it. So hopefully it will be of use to some of you who are in the field, in the field of security studies, but also who might be planning research projects that require, some of the similar issues. Because oftentimes when we are studying contentious politics, especially as a grad students, you often have to weigh a lot of risks and reward. These are very practical issues related to you want to finish on time, what kind of funding do you have, whether your institute will approve the project or not. So those are some of the issues that I plan on dive into today. But before I start, I thought that maybe quickly I'll tell you what the radical right in Canada looks like, and I'll give you a little bit of background of my project. So when we think of radical right in Canada, this is something that most of you might be aware of. The idea of white supremacist groups who have this idea of racial superiority and they see other groups as threat. They often believe in violence, and some of these groups now at least have this ideology of accelerationism. So the idea is that they want to create chaos in the society. They want to create violence, which will lead to a civil war between, white people and non-white people. And in the end, they will win, and which will result in a white ethno-state. In Canada, you can see this in some of the more radical groups, such as the Atomwaffen and the BASE, the Blood and Honor. They are now on Canada's terrorist entity list. So they are officially designated terrorist groups in Canada. But that is what we generally think of when we think of radical right, extreme behavior and racial superiority. However, that's not the only way the radical right manifests in Canada. And other manifestation is in ideological terms. So these are groups or movements who don't use racial terminology, and there can be multiple reasons for it. One could be that they see that the groups that were very racially charged, either were not very popular with the public, but also how law enforcement is dealing with it, right? That these groups are now on the terrorist entity list and they cannot do a lot of the things that they would have done otherwise. So then these groups, instead of using racial terminology, use ideological terminology. So they don't say that they are against, brown or black or other people of color. They would say that they are against ideas of globalism, against feminism, against Islamism. Now, this serves two strategic functions for them. First, it kind of expands their support base, right? Because now they're not just appealing to people who are strictly thinking in racial terms. They can also get support from people who might not be thinking in racial terms and just, might not like certain ideologies. But another advantage that they get by using ideological terms is that they are able to attract sometimes people of color within their fold. So, let's say there is a group who says that I stand for Canadian values or I stand against globalism. in their private chats, especially online or when they are just by themselves, they would be still using some racial terms. But in a public protest, they would always advertise themselves as people who are standing up for Canada, or who are against a government who maybe is exploiting people. And when they use those terminology, they can attract people of color who might also have grievances against the government or might also have grievances against ideology. Now, when this happens, this gives these groups cover because now they can say, look, we have people of color showing up to our protest, or we have them within our fold. How can we be racist? So this is another strategic, idea that they use because, instead of using more racial terms, they can use ideological terms. It expands their support base and helps them ward off criticism that they are actually racist. And another important manifestation of radical right in Canada is that it tends to be very specifically anti-Islam. So it often puts Judeo-Christian values against Islam, because Judeo-Christian is something that is more Canadian and Islam is something that is very foreign. And once again, when they use these terminologies, they would always say, well, we are not against any group of people, we are against an idea or an ideology, so we cannot be racist. And another way what happens is that when they're doing these protests like against Islam, they can also attract people of color such as Hindu nationalists or some other individuals who might be people of color but might not like Islam, who will show up to these protests. And once again, they would say that it's not about race because look, we have people of color among ourselves. So this is how the radical right is in Canada. So just to show you that it is not just about white supremacy or very radical extreme groups who think in terms of race. It can also be groups who talk in terms of ideology, and as a result are able to have a broader support base. So when I looked into how radical right was in Canada, I tried to figure out, wow, this is so complicated. So much stuff is going on, more violent protesters, less violent protesters. Some people are ideologically against the other. Some people are racially against the other. So I came up with a continuum of what I thought better explains how mobilization in radical right in Canada looks like. So it's not about either this person is a member of a radical right group or not, right? So it's no longer a binary between, yes, I'm a member or no, I'm not. It's kind of a spectrum where people can differ significantly on what they support and what they are a part of. So just to give you an example, mobilization towards the radical right can take many forms, right? So if we think of a starting point which is neutral, so you're not politically active, you don't care about any issue, then a person would just be at a neutral space. But maybe you are somebody who supports a cause, but you don't take any action. So maybe you think that, yes, I don't like government's immigration policy, it's too broad, it's too open, I am against it. You passively have some sympathy to a cause, let's say anti-immigration, but you are not actually doing anything about it, right? You're not going out to protest, you're not writing letters to the government, you're not, joining a group. So if you are just not doing anything, just saying stuff, then you would, what I call, be considered a passive supporter, right? You're vocally sympathetic, but you're not actually taking any action. Then if you take any action, you can become an active supporter. But active supporters can be of two types, right? They can be nonviolent or they can be violent. Now, if you're nonviolent, right? So let's say you are somebody who, doesn't like the government's immigration policy and you want to take some action for it. You can take some action without actually joining a group. So let's say you go to an anti-immigration protest, then you would be taking an informal action because you didn't actually join a group formally. You just thought that this group is doing some action that, I want to do too, because it aligns with what I also think. So you go to that protest, but you're not actually a member of that group. So that is what I would call an informal form of support, right? So you are going there, but you're not actually doing it as part of a group. On the other hand, you can also officially join a group. So let's say you officially join an anti-immigrant group, or you officially join, an anti-Islam group. and then you participate in a protest, then you raise money on the group's behalf, then you recruit other people on its behalf. So that would be a more formal form of participation. However, in both cases, you're not doing any violence, you're not taking part in any violent action. So you are an active supporter, but non-violent. And then, of course, on the very far end of the spectrum is that you are taking action that is violent, right? So you're actually taking part in committing some violence. Again, you can do it on your own. So you commit violence where you go around, go out and harm some people, but you're not doing it actually on behalf of a group. So Bissonnette, who was the Quebec mosque shooter, would fit under this category. He was a lone actor. He acted by himself. He wasn't officially a part of a group, but he was, kind of a lot of the ideologies were similar to some of the radical right groups, such as related to anti-immigration and anti-Islam. On the other hand, you can also become violent in a more formal fashion, which would be that you actually join a group such as the Atomwaffen or the Base or Blunted Honor. You are a member of a group, you plan with other members, this is how we should conduct an attack, or this is, what kind of chaos we are creating, and then you take part in that action. So that's a more formal way of, committing violence. All this to say, though, only that instead of looking at recruitment or mobilization in these groups as like a binary, that either this member or this person is a member of a right-wing group or ideology or not, it's much more complicated now because the groups themselves are kind of divided across the spectrum, and you don't always need to be violent to show your support. The people have multiple avenues through, they can become mobilized without always becoming violent, which kind of, expands their support base, because some people might still be sympathetic toward these groups without wanting to take part in violence. So this is just a little bit background on my research, but now I'm going to dive into, the main ethical questions. So when I wanted to study this, there was two ways, previous research on terrorism or extremism, some of it is quantitative. So, people look at, percentage of people who committed acts, or what is the percentage of people who support this particular group. But quantitative data doesn't always give you the depth that you need to understand somebody's motivation, right? If somebody is joining an extremist group, it's not just about, okay, the numbers, like, okay, this many percentage of people are joining this group. We need to understand why, what is their motivation internally for them psychologically. And all of these things require a bit more in-depth research, which for me meant that I wanted to go out and actually interview these people, because I wanted to talk to them and listen in their own words. Why was it that they as an individual wanted to join a radical right-wing group in Canada? So I wanted to conduct that kind of research, which meant that I wanted to conduct live course interviews. I wanted to know what kind of household they grew up in, what was their childhood like, everything from when they were born to the point when they became a member of a radical right-wing group or movement. So that was how my research was designed. And another part of my research design was participant observation. So what I did was that I actually went to their protests, their public protests, where they were talking about issues, where they were protesting, where they were kind of fighting with counter protesters or the police at some points, to again kind of understand how they behave in groups. What are some of the issues that are important? What are the motivations for them to show up and fight for some of the things that they believed needed fighting for. Now, as you know, when you tell the ethics committee or ethics board that I want to go out and actually interview extremists, they have a lot of questions. So for my ethics protocol, it was a full committee ethics review, which I don't want to go too much into because a lot of you probably already familiar with it when you're, doing any kind of project that requires ethics approval from the ethics board. But all this to say that it went through a lot of revision because it was a full committee ethics board, and they always had questions. Okay, how are you going to make sure that you are protecting your participants, you're protecting yourself, but also, that this research is actually worth doing, right? How do you justify that the risk of this research is worth the reward that you'll get at the end. So that's a lot of procedural ethics, right? When you're telling your university ethics board that, yes, I'm going to take these precautions. I know, you know what I will be doing. These are the rewards. This is why this research is useful. But when you're doing research on contentious issues, that's just one part of it. The procedural ethics that, oh, I need to get this approval done so I can get started. There is a lot of practical ethics that come out once you are in the field, but nobody prepared you for, and you are making a decision in the moment because like, oh, I never thought I would be in this situation. So those are the ones that I want to focus more on today. So the very first is the issue of access, right? So let's say, you say that you want to talk to an extremist. Why would they talk to you? Why would they talk to an outsider who they have never met? They have a lot of suspicions about always that what is the agenda of this person wanting to talk to me? So the very first question, the very first step is to actually get them to agree to talk to you. So I read a lot of research by some of the other scholars who have done these kind of interviews, and I've looked at how they have done it. And a lot of them started off online, right? So online, you try to find which people are part of which kind of radical groups, and then you contact them, explain what you're trying to do, and then see if they are responsive to your request. So it's very important that you're honest, right? Because there is already a lot of mistrust of researchers, because again, if you are somebody who is taking part in contentious politics, you're always worried, is law enforcement going to be spying on me? Is any information I give going to be used against me in some way or form? So mostly people wouldn't want to talk to you. So the more honest you are that, yes, I'm a researcher. Yes, this is what I'm doing. This is why I would like to talk to you. And, sometimes they'll ask you, okay, what do you personally believe? And you, again, can be honest that, yes, personally, I don't agree with your views, but, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to understand what motivated you to join this particular group. And I did it two ways. So I contacted them online, but I also, again, went to some of their public protests. So in public protests, the good thing is that you don't have to worry too much about issues of secrecy because they're out in the public. They're giving interviews to the media. They're available for everybody to talk to. So, you can just walk up to them and explain yourself. Now, the thing is, honesty is good. However, in this kind of research, it still, doesn't ensure that you will get the access that you want. So just to give you a reference point, I contacted 117 people over 3 years. And at the end, from contact to building rapport to actually getting to sit down with them and get to an interview, I only got 20. This is how difficult it is to get access to a population that feels that they are, engaging in contentious action and nobody else is listening to them. So I'll just show you some example, right? Most of the time, the kind of responses I got were, a little bit aggressive. They just do not want to talk to you because, either they do not trust you, or in other ways, even if they're not aggressive with you as a person, they just don't trust that you are able to understand because they have a preconceived notion. Specifically in my case, they thought that as an academic, I'm going to be far left. I'm going to what they call, I have been indoctrinated in a Marxist tradition because I'm part of a liberal university. So these were the responses that I got most of the time. So, even after following all the protocols about honesty, being very clear, explaining everything, having multiple avenues, online, public protest, I was only able to get 20 interviews at the end, even though I contacted over 100 people throughout the course of my research. The second very important thing, and this is where your ethics board will also push you a lot, is informed consent. So it's not just enough to get them to agree that, will you please give me an interview? It's that they need to be informed what is the purpose, what exactly is the research for. So it's not that you're giving me an interview, is that why why exactly am I trying to get it. So for that, it is very important that your words and action align, right? So if you are telling them that I'm using this interview for my dissertation, then, this is what it should be. But if you tell them that it's only going to be for my dissertation and only my committee is going to read it, but then you also plan to publish it as a book, then it would not be informed consent, because maybe that person didn't consent to, it being later published in a public platform, right? So you need to be very clear in what they're consenting to. Do you want to present it at a conference later, right? Are you planning to go to the media and talk about this research? It's very important that they're very clear in what they're consenting to. And Driscoll and Schuster, their research focuses on, studying criminal groups in authoritarian states. And they talk about a concept called national security state. So the idea is that sometimes, governments can take the work of researchers and use it for their own purposes, whatever those purposes are related to, authoritarian purposes or national security purposes, even if you didn't sign up for it as a researcher. So you as a researcher need to be sure what exactly is your research going to be used for, and then you need to be clear about that with your participants. And you have to also give them the option that they can change their mind after research too. Of course, there can be a time limit, but in my case, it was that, after they give me an interview, within 3 weeks, they had 3 weeks time, they could send me an email saying, I don't want my interview to be used in your research anymore, because after that time, I was going to, include that data into, remove all the identifiers and include it, as a group. So it would be difficult for me to remove individual interviews. But this is just to show you that, another important aspect of research is that you don't just need to get their consent to give you an interview. It's all these other things that you have to think about. And just to give you a reference point, oftentimes you see that in journalism, that journalists can go undercover and, they can, when they are studying any kind of extremist groups or a criminal group, they can go undercover and try to get a news story. You cannot do that as a researcher. It is very difficult to get ethics approval, but also it might also depend on your personal ethics too, right? Is it something that you want to do, or do you feel that by being honest, you're going to get better data? Either way, this is just to show you that journalistic ethics can differ from being an academic. You have to get informed consent, and it's very difficult for you to kind of do the work where you're going undercover and getting information. Then another important one is you promise confidentiality. But again, if you're studying criminal groups, extremist groups, what if they give some information which is dangerous to somebody else, or you feel that you also have the ethical need to report, because yes, you promise them confidentiality, but they're telling you something that can put somebody else in danger. And if you don't report it, that can also have consequences. So in order to deal with that problem, some of the researchers who have done this kind of research have talked about that never ask operational questions, right? Never ask them any plans of what they have done or what they are planning to do, because if you ask them those questions, then you'll get the information and then you're going to have to decide, do I report it or not? But if you are very clear that you are going to protect confidentiality of your research participant, then don't ask them questions that will put you in that ethical dilemma. Do I report it to authorities, law enforcement, my university, or do I not? Keep the conversation focused on the information that you want to do. So in my case, I'm only interested in why exactly are you joining a radical right-wing group. I'm not interested in what are you planning to do as a member of this group. So I'm not going to ask those questions. And also, finally, delete sensitive information. So oftentimes in conversation, they will let something slip out, their own personal information, a personal information of a relative or somebody else, sometimes children. You don't need that for your research. Remove it quickly, also to make sure you are protecting the confidentiality, not just of the person that you're interviewing, but also anybody else within their circle, right? Because that other person didn't give you any consent. This person is just giving you some personal information about them. So, just delete that kind of information. And again, promising confidentiality then, sometimes is a motivator for them to talk to you. So in my case, some people mentioned that they didn't get approval from their leader of the group that they could talk to me because I'm an outsider research. But if I talk to you, please respect my confidentiality. They can never know that I talked to you, right? So it's very important for me now to keep that promise. That then brings me to the issue of safety. So generally, when we're talking about safety in field research, we think about two people, right? You as a researcher and the participant that you're interviewing. But again, safety is not just limited to these two people. It can apply to, once again, the family members of that person. So their children, their spouse, any grandparents, because if their safety is violated, that can impact other people in their life. It can also extend to your research assistant. So if somebody is working with you, so not you just as a researcher, but also any assistant or anybody else who is working with you, any kind of interlocutors, anybody who is the go-between between you as a researcher and somebody who is giving you an interview, it also applies to them. So even though all these other people are not your research subjects, you as a researcher are responsible to ensure the safety of all of them, because they are in that position because of you. You have started this process of research. So you are responsible for all of them. This is an argument that Elizabeth Wood has made. Her research focuses on civil war in El Salvador. And she was talking about how, oftentimes, in order to get a single interview, you have to go through a lot of people, and a lot of people, everybody who you go through is you are responsible for their safety. It's important. So in my case, I'll give you some examples. Like even when I gave them option that we'll meet at a public place, I just come by them myself. There is nobody else. People were still very scared just to meet with me in person in an open public space. They wanted to bring other people with them. Then there were people who were worried about not just their own safety, but safety of their children, especially if they were somebody who were going through in some kind of tension within their group. Maybe they had left it, maybe they were thinking about leaving. So again, very important for them that if they talk to me, how would that impact their safety, the safety of their children? And then finally, the safety of the researcher, right? So as I said, when I started my research, I was going to public protests, I was talking to these people online, and I was always honest about who I am. Right. And because I had ethics approval of doing face-to-face interviews, I wasn't allowed to go into their private online accounts and check, what they're talking about. Even, by myself or undercover, I didn't have approval to do online research. It was only limited to offline. But this email I got from the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, who do monitor some of the online conversations. And then they told me, how my research is being perceived. And, some people who have more violent tendencies are talking about it, and how I should also be careful, as I'm doing field research. But this is just to show you that, how safety matters for a lot of people, but also based on the field, your experiences in the field, you make decisions. So after I got this email, I reduced my participation in public protests because I made a cost benefit analysis that yes, I want my research, but also if this is going to put me in danger or other people who will associate with me, then maybe I need to find another way, a better way to do research, as opposed to being this public with some of the people that I was talking to. Finally, there is also an important role of emotions, and there's multiple types of emotions that come up when you're studying contentious politics. First is the issue of rapport, right? It doesn't matter how much you disagree with your research subject. It doesn't matter how much you don't like what the person is saying. You need to build some sort of rapport to get them to talk to you, right? Because if there is at least they need some level of trust to see that you are a person to whom they will talk about all the things that are in their mind or whatever information that you're trying to get, right? But when you're trying to build rapport, you will also feel fear, because yes, I want to talk to you, but also I don't know who you are. So, and you belong to a group that I've read all these things in the media about is, more right-wing, more racist. You can be also misogynistic. That's at least what I know about. So it's a very convoluted way of doing research because you are a human being, right? So you, on one hand, are trying to build rapport. On the other hand, are afraid yourself. Like, I don't know who you are, and I have to, sit down with you one-on-one, get all this information. So this is something that I found out, I also learned from Kathleen Blee's work. Her work focuses on interviewing KKK women specifically. And this is what I did in my work too. So she said that, when she was talking to these women, it doesn't matter how much you disagree with them, you don't let that show, right? So you don't let them know that you are feeling offensive. You don't, disagree with them. You, kind of withhold your emotions when they're talking to you. And also because, you want to get that information. Part of reason you're doing this research is to understand what is happening in their minds. So that means really withholding your own personal emotions and trying to get as much information from them as you can. However, she also noted that building rapport is, it's not as easy, and it's not the, it's not how you think that, oh, just because I build a rapport, I'll be able to get all the information that I want, because, they can still lie to you. They can still say some of the things that, how they want you to perceive them. And she also mentioned that even though sometimes when you're building a rapport, you feel that maybe you can feel some empathy for the person, you can try to understand where they're coming from. But when she was talking to racist activists, it was very difficult to build that kind of sympathy, right? So even though you're trying to build a rapport, trying to get that information, at the same time, this person is saying a lot of these things which you disagree with. So it was difficult, again, you're in a difficult position. You're managing fear, you're managing trying to build a rapport, but you're also managing, do I have empathy for this person? And she also talked about that another worry that you have as a researcher is that if I start to build empathy, how, will that stigma attach to me as a researcher as well? So somebody who says, oh, I was interviewing this right-wing person and I kind of felt empathy for them, will other people think that now I am kind of like them, right? So the political stigma of a right-wing activist, would that attach to me as a scholar as well, as somebody who is maybe justifying what they're trying to do, right? Even though I'm just trying to understand. So all this to say that in the field, this is something that you don't know while you're filling out your ethics form. This is something you understand in the field, talking to different people, seeing that I feel fear, but I also need to build a rapport. I can't feel empathy because, they're saying all these things, but I still need to sit there and listen because I do want all the information that they can give me. And then you also have the insider and outsider dynamics, which, can refer to the fact that sometimes if you are a member of a group that you're trying to study, you have access to a certain knowledge which you don't have if you are an outsider. So in the case of right-wing groups, for example, they saw that I am not white, right? They saw that. So they often use this to their advantage in a way by saying that, well, clearly I'm not a racist, because if I was, why would I talk to somebody like you, right? And to give me that impression as an outsider that, just by talking to me, it can erase any kind of racist connotation that, media might have associated with their group. But you also need to be then wary of lies. Yes, a person is telling you all these things, but how many of them are true? And Dr. Liane Fuji had a very good article where she talks about the issue of metadata. So the idea that when somebody lies to you, or when you feel that they are lying to you, take that as data as well. Why is this person lying to you? What are they trying to convey to you? How do they want you to perceive them? So instead of, if somebody lies thinking that, oh, they lie, now this data is not useful anymore, instead use that as data, use the lie as in data itself. Why did they feel the need to lie to you in the first place? And then, of course, you triangulate it with other sources, right? So don't just believe everything that they tell you in an interview. Triangulate it with, other researchers, media reports, policy reports, any kind of other information that you can find. So this is something that, again, going back to Kathleen Lee's work, because she's a white woman, and when she was talking to KKK white women activists, she mentioned that even though she was outsider to their politics, she was insider because she was a white person, which helped her understand a lot of the descriptions and things that they were talking about. It wasn't the case for me, because for me, I always had to work through the lies or any other kind of information to see what exactly do they mean by that, instead of taking that as face value. So an example would be, this is a poster which just says Canadians for Canada rally. So for an outsider, it might feel that, oh, this is just people who are, talking about their anger with the government. It has nothing to do with any kind of racism. But the more you do a deep dive, the groups that were there, the conversation that happened, you realize that actually there was a lot more going on than what meets the eye. And same with, sometimes groups in Canada split from each other, saying that I am not a racist. That's why I split with that group, because, they were super racist and I am not that racist. So I'm not going to be a part of them anymore. But again, doing a deep dive, you feel that the fighting was sometimes is on other issues, finances or leadership disagreements, or any kind of other strategic differences. And it is not always that they say, oh, that group is more racist, I don't want to be associated with them. But again, you as an outsider, you need to go deeper instead of just believing things at face value. And this is just, I think this is my final point, which would be that, when you are a researcher, you are required to be objective. But at the same time, you also have to be aware that there is a power imbalance, right? You are a researcher who is gathering other people's story. And in the end, you have the power how you will present it, right? Are you going to make them look the bad guy? Are you going to present the way they want it to be presented? Are you going to present it through your frame of reference and how you see the world? So as a researcher, you are in a position of power over your research subjects. And this was very clear because a lot of the times when I was talking to these groups or these people, they would always want to emphasize a point that how they're not racist and how they are against this thing, but not that thing, because they really wanted me to portray them in a certain way. Because they felt that, I, as a researcher, could talk to police, I could talk to law enforcement, I could talk to other people, I could talk to media, and they didn't want me to say anything that they felt would shed a bad light on them. Same again, calling them, really emphasizing they're not a white supremacist, they have people of color as friends, they have people of color in their family, really wanted me to talk about that when I'm writing my research, so that, it is clarified that they are not, a white supremacist or a racist. This is, again, just to show you that even though they told me that, there were other reports that said that, that is not the entire truth. There is, other researchers or people who are studying it in the online space would have talked about that, sometimes people would portray one face to a more public audience and then talk about other things in a more private setting. And once again, if I were to go back to Blee's point, she made this point that, yes, generally we talk about power imbalance, saying that researcher has more power than the research subject. But it is also very important to note that when you're studying contentious politics, and people who are in the criminal space or, who are in an extremist space, they can also harm you as a researcher, right? Or as a human being. So sometimes the power imbalance can be reversed as well. So it's not always researcher having more power on a research subject. It can also be, if your research subject is more extremist in a more criminal space, they can also harm you in certain settings. So, power imbalance can go both ways. So what should you do when you're preparing to go in the field? Think early. So think long before you actually go into the field, some of the issues that you could come across. Think beyond your ethics review board. So there would be a lot of things that you might not have to worry about when you're getting your ethics approval from your institution, but you will encounter once you're in the field. Specifically related to interviews, always make sure it's a two-way dialogue. So you're not there interrogating a person, you are really listening, you're talking to them, and then get input from them. What is safety for them? What does confidentiality look like to them? What are some of their fears? Because they are, at the end of the day, your research subject, and you are the one who is taking their stories. So when you're talking about issues that relate to safety, confidentiality, consent, ask them. Literally, Dr. Fuji would say, ask them, what does these things look like to them? So you can, be better prepared as you make some of these decisions in the field. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you, everyone. And I'll hand it over to Brandon.
Thank you for that, Auden. That was a great presentation. And I think I speak on behalf of everyone when I say you're one of the bravest academics in this country. The fact that you were willing to carpool with these people's, wow, you're incredibly brave.
Or naive at that point. I would say just naive.
Well, we have a number of questions here in the chat, so I'm not going to rely on any of my own. I think we have about half an hour, so let's get right to them then. Auden, do you think Islamophobia, this is from Henry, is a unique feature of the Canadian radical right, or a feature that is more emphasized here than it is elsewhere?
Good question. No, I would say no, not just Canada. It is very, very, in Europe, I would say, in some cases, even more, on the front lines, where they would not even say they're anti-Islam, they're anti-Muslim. Like in Europe, they would be even more verbal. Same in United States as well. What I found interesting was, and here I can only talk about Canada because I haven't done enough comparative research with Europe, is that how people of color, some people of color who also didn't like Islam were showing at these protests. So that was a bit of an interesting feature to see that, when it comes to anti-Islam sentiment, it's not limited to, just the white population. It's a much broader sentiment that, is present in different parts of Canada, among different communities in Canada. Yeah. But no, I wouldn't say it's specific to Canada. No.
Thank you for that. Fateh has a question as well. It's, how do you conceive of the relationship in the race ideology distinction? Do you think ideology discourse simply veils the race divide, or is it perhaps more complex and dynamic?
Yeah, excellent question. So this is, something that I still struggle with as I am writing mine, because I do think that in certain cases, ideology is a cover for race, right? Because they do think that there are certain things they cannot say in racial terms, but if they use ideological cover, they can get away with it. But I also would agree that it is more complex, because I'll give you an example, right? So let's say M103, when M103 was passed, it's just a motion which says it is against all forms of hate, including Islamophobia. So it specifically mentioned Islamophobia as a word, right? Now, when there is a certain population, who would make it a racial issue, even though they wouldn't admit it, but when they're talking about Muslim, they're technically talking about Black and brown people who they think, are Muslims. But when protests were happening on M103, there were a lot of, as I was saying, people from East Asian background showing up, people from South Asian background showing up, and they were talking in terms of, why is Islam getting more special status that Christianity doesn't have, or Hinduism doesn't have? So in those cases, I found that maybe it's more complex. So yes, those people have an anti-Islam sentiment, but maybe it's coming from a place of ideology as opposed to race, because themselves they're not white, but they feel that maybe Islam as a religion is getting special treatment as opposed to Christianity or Hinduism. Even though M103 was just a motion, it wasn't a law, but the way the opposition was, the way they were talking about it was that it somehow means that it gives Islam special protection, which it doesn't give, other religions. So they were more talking about in ideological and racial terms. So I would say in those cases, I definitely found it more complex to analyze, that is it racial if it's, a Hindu from Bangladesh saying to me that, oh, that's why I don't like M103 because it gives Islam special treatment, or is it more ideological, is it anti-Islam? Is it, they don't like Muslims because of their skin color? Yeah, it was definitely more complex in those instances for me to analyze.
Well, thank you for that. We have another question here from Emily, which is, do you think at the core or any of anxieties of these groups have a bearing on reality that's misdirected into xenophobia? Example, fears around surveillance and neoliberalism that are directed at the other?
Yes, I think, yes, there is definitely a segment which I would say is misdirected. And the reason I say that, because over the course of my research, so I did it from 2018 till now, there were a lot of people who I met in the beginning who were members, but by the end had left the movement. Right. And when I asked them, like, what was some of the reasons that they left, was that the more they got involved and the more they realized that actually it is not about the issues that they joined initially. Like, it is not about the socioeconomic issues, or it is not about, equality for everyone. That the more they got involved, the more they felt uncomfortable, and then, they left it. So yes, I would say that there is a certain segment who is misdirected, who might be thinking in some more socioeconomic terms, but they got involved with a group that is thinking in more racial or cultural terms. But then these are also the people, who might leave after a while, because the more they get involved, the more they realize it is not what they signed up for.
Thank you. We have two questions here, and I think they sort of tie in, from Fateh and Cheryl. So I'm going to read them both, and they're around intervention from security and information being disclosed. So even after following protocol, are you, as a researcher, concerned with intervention from security agencies? I.e., are you worried about being asked to be an informant, and how would you navigate this? And part two, what might you do if an interviewee discloses incriminating evidence? Does the researcher have an obligation to report on such information? Example, battery to the authorities despite this confidentiality.
Yeah. So I will answer the second question first. Yes, even as an, ethical, with your ethics review board, yes, if there are certain things that if they are a danger to themselves or others, and if you know of imminent, like something dangerous could happen, you have a responsibility to report despite promising confidentiality. And this is something that you are also required to include in your consent letter. So you mentioned that I will protect confidentiality except in these cases. And then you mentioned the cases, whereas if some kind of information comes up, I have to report. So yes, there is an institutional safeguard where your university would tell you that you can promise confidentiality up to this point. And yes, if a child is in danger, if there is some abuse is happening, yes, you have a responsibility to report. In the first question, where it is concerned about being an informant, yes, that is a concern. And I would say I learned this a lot from people who were doing research on religious extremism. A lot of them told me how it was now so difficult for them to get access because people just didn't trust them anymore, because people thought that you might be an informant under the guise of researcher. So in this case, I was worried about law enforcement, but one good thing is that when I started, it wasn't that big an issue at the time, or maybe not that much attention was being paid to it than it is now. Again, I never asked any personal information. And also I was deleting data after I used what I needed. So I would delete audio recordings, delete any of the personal information. So even if I was, let's say, called out by a court, or I could only say, well, I've only left this, which is not very useful for you anymore, right? So this is, again, part of your research is that you get the information, you take what you need, and then you delete the rest of it. So you're not putting yourself in a situation where you're court ordered or you have to hand it over to a state authority.
Thank you for that response. How might you assuage interview subjects of their confidentiality / management of their data when research is paid for by agencies with histories of surveillance / exploitation? Example, the carceral system. And that's another question from Cheryl.
Yeah. Excellent question. And that this was, again, it goes back to the point of honesty. A lot of them did ask me, like, who is funding your research? What are you going to do with it? So I would tell them, nobody's funding this specific project, but my PhD is funded by SHRC and University of Toronto. So this, as I was saying, led to most of them saying no, right? Like I asked 117 people and only 20 of them by the end agreed to participate and talk to me. So yes, I was always completely honest. And yes, you cannot force people to give you an interview, right? So if somebody has a negative view of researchers, or if they don't trust where your funding is coming from, they're not going to talk to you. And of course, you cannot push them further, right? Again, you have to respect their decision. So yeah, I think the reason that I got more no's, the good thing about it is that at least I was being honest. Like I can say confidently that I never deceived. I wasn't going around deceiving them. The reason they were able to make a choice, and most of them made a choice to not talk to me in person.
And this is a part 2 to that question from Cheryl. It's, should researchers avoid accepting grant funding from such agencies out of consideration for the trust of interview subjects when possible?
So this is what I was talking about, Jesse Driscoll's article, Spies Like Us. He talks about it in that, because in the case of US, specifically in war on terror, a lot of funding was coming from, Pentagon, the military, and how that impacts how your research is both viewed by the research subjects, but also how it is used after. Is government, use it in their security programs and things like that. I think that I would say that's a researcher's choice, right? I don't know if I can say that they should or they shouldn't, because again, anytime you're doing a research, you're always dealing with a lot of things. You do need money. So if you're not getting it from, some of these agencies which have, you don't trust, do you have another option? So is the option not doing that research at all? Or is it that you can raise funding from something else? So I would say that's an individual, researcher's choice, depending on their research question. And then they will do a cost benefit analysis. Is the research worth taking this risk, or is it not? Because, it's very difficult to make this, because as we all know, as researchers, how fund deprived we are most of the time. So it really is, an individual researcher's decision at the time when they're applying for a grant. Yeah.
All righty. Well, thank you for that. We have another question from Henry, and it's, what motivations do you think interviewees had for lying? What do you think they might have stood to gain for lying?
Yeah, I think the very first one was protecting their image, right? So again, because I was an outsider, just by talking to me, they really wanted to emphasize this point that I'm not a racist because I'm talking to you, right? So I think one was really the image. And a lot of them emphasized how nobody ever listens to them. Nobody, whether it's the media, whether it's other academics, never, portray them or are honest about them. So it was, I would say, protecting their image was the first one. And I think generally another thing about interviews in general is that oftentimes people are reconstructing memories, right? So maybe all of us do this a little bit, that we embellish when we are thinking about something from the past. But I think the second is that interview as a process is reconstruction of past memories. So maybe part of it is just, when they're talking about it, they want to embellish certain things to make them look a certain way. But I would say image was the number one that I thought was the reason that they were trying to be evasive or, dishonest at some points.
I'm actually going to jump in and ask a quick question then. So they're trying to be evasive and then put on a front that they're not these bad people. And this is sort of ties into your method. Are you interested in sort of doing this again, this process, this methodology, once, you're established as an academic? Would you take this on again? And if there wasn't the safeguarding required for, I know ethics approval in Germany and other countries is far less demanding than what it is here. Would you go after it more likely abroad than you would here? I'm just thinking off the top of my head, and sometimes an envy of these other researchers. Perhaps that's not the right thing to admit to an ethics panel, but
no, but I understand, because I was the only time I read it was, I think, a Swedish grad student who was able to get an ethics approval to go undercover into one of the right-wing groups. And I thought you would never get that in Canada. Like that's a big no-no, very, to do that. But I think, yes, I definitely have more experience. Now I also am a better judge of situations and characters. As I said, when I started in 2018, I was just going wherever I saw an opportunity to go. I was naive and I wouldn't put myself in some of those situations again. I also now know better how to work context, how to trust different people, and how, what are the safest way to get some of the safe information that you require without putting yourself in, some of situation where later you're like, I shouldn't have gone there or things like that. So I think, yes, I feel I would be more experienced if I did it the second time around. Do I want to do it the second time around? We will see once I defend this. I take a 1 year break to recover.
Yeah, I think I have nerves about the thought of you doing it again. So I can't imagine how you're feeling about it. Wow, it's so impressive. So another question from Henry here. Did you notice connections between mobilization in these groups and the rise of far-right politics on the national level in formal political parties? And for our purposes, let's say that obviously the Canadian landscape.
Yeah. I think so. Here I would because it wasn't the central point of my dissertation, so I wouldn't have data to give you, but I would just speak to what I saw. So what I saw was definitely the rise of PPC. Right. So the more, these groups are becoming activated, because PPC was formed, the People's Party of Canada was formed after some of these right-wing groups were established and they were protesting. And it was when Maxime Bernier formed this party, he made a point to go to these protests that were happening. Right. So it did seem that he saw that this is what's happening in Canada. And when he was running the first time, he was on his Twitter account making a lot of references to what's happened in Trump or what happened with Brexit, the idea that elitist parties, the Liberals, the NDP, the Conservatives, that's why he broke off from Conservative, because they are one of those elitist globalist parties as well. He really wanted to capitalize on that kind of discontent that he saw emerging. So the fact that People's Party of Canada was formed after some of these groups were gaining momentum in Canada, I would say, yeah, it seems like there might be a little bit of correlation there. As this discontent is increasing, some political parties are, trying to capitalize on it. Good thing with Canada, though, is thankfully they have not been very successful till now. Two other parties I also want to talk about is the Canadian Nationalist Party that was also formed after the 2015 election, and the other one was National Canadian Alliance. I think that's in Calgary. So both of those also are very far right. If you look at their manifestos, anti-immigration or stopping immigration for 10, 20 years, things like that. Yeah. So I would say yes, it seems.
Sorry to cut you off there. I was just wondering, the Canadian Nationalist Party, now I'm not trying to speak out of turn here, but I believe that's the party that was, trying to make the Roman salute come back. Is that correct?
Yeah. And the leader, so the weird thing was that when it was registered, there was a lot of backlash that how come Elections Canada registered this party, because he was very clearly anti-Semitic. But then they were registered. But later on, the leader, Travis Patron, I think his full name is, he was then arrested by the RCMP on charges of abuse and, other things. So he, was arrested anyways. But it just goes to show you. But yeah, they were very visibly far right, anti-Semitic, making references to Hitler, Germany in a sympathetic way. And it was very surprising for a lot of people that they were able to register with Elections Canada as a formal party.
Do you know if they put any safeguards in place to sort of prevent that going forward? Because I do recall briefly some of his videos where, he's using all these old like anti-Semitic tropes, like the tribe or something, like things like this. I'm sure you remember it better than I do. But has there been any sort of safeguards put in place?
From the party itself or by the Elections Canada?
Elections Canada, yeah.
I honestly don't know, because I haven't heard of any other party or person like trying to register then after that. So I don't know if there are, because I think the rules for getting a party registered are very basic. Like you need 100 signatures or something. You need to, have this much support, which they were able to show the first time. So I think for that to happen, there need to be a fundamental change regarding Election Canada, saying that these kind of ideologies are, not allowed to run. I don't know if they have said anything like that they wouldn't register a party of a certain ideology specifically. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for that. We have a question here from Ariel. What do you think the incentive was for your interview subjects to speak to you, besides you creating the conditions for them to feel comfortable?
Yeah. So I read a lot about this when I was studying other researchers who have talked to, perpetrators of genocide or perpetrators in civil war. And the central motivation for a lot of people is that they want to be heard. Like we as human beings want to be heard, but specifically if you are somebody who feels that they are always villainized by society, you really want to be heard. It's almost like you want to tell your side of the story. So this is what I found, that even though I was only able to talk to 20 people, the people that I did talk to were very open. They wanted to tell me everything about their life. The interviews lasted sometimes up to 4 hours because they were just talking and I didn't interrupt, even they were telling me something, important in their life, even if wasn't directly related to my research. I think it's just the feeling of being heard, specifically if you feel that you are being villainized by everyone and nobody understands you. So I think it's a little bit of that building rapport and being a good listener, where I think they just want to be heard, or tell you their story, their side of the story, basically. Yeah.
And this sort of ties into two little questions I have. And it sort of ties back to what you were talking about, is sort of maintaining like rapport, right? Have you maintained a rapport with any of these people since that? Maybe you exchange an email once in a while, like, hey, how are you? And was there any particular experiences of how you refer to it as like empathy building that you had that sort of stick out in your mind that you might want to share?
Yeah. So I think for the first one, there's only one person that I, because I didn't contact them afterwards, but there was this one person who contacted me themselves after, because they had left the group and they just wanted me to update me that they had left it and how that process is going for them, for their family. So they just like to update me. So then I also check in with them sometimes, like, how is it going? Are you still facing threats for leaving? Or, have you found some support? So there's only that one person where I, stay in contact with a little bit, but others I didn't. After I did my interview, I will send them a copy of my dissertation, because that was part of the consent letter, that they will see how the final product will turn out. And I think the second question of empathy, yes. And it was, it was difficult, is that sometimes somebody would be talking to me and they're saying all these things which are, not great about other people, or even other people who look like me, so it's not just any particular group, but even other people who look like me. But then they will tell me something like they have battled cancer in their life, right? Or their mother is going through cancer. And then you do, like, I did feel sorry for them. Like I did feel some empathy or some sympathy there. So yeah, that was, I can't say I did it. Yes, I did, right? Because there was almost like there is two versions of this person. One is their political ideas, another is who they are as a human being, as a father, as a brother, as a parent. And they, if they're anytime talking about those kind of struggles, then yeah, that was a weird kind of emotional space to be. Yeah.
Oh, it's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. So just before, I'm going to ask one more question, but if anybody has any other questions that they want to get into the chat, please do so. We're going to be ending shortly. This sort of ties into that last response there. The things that they were willing to share with you, sometimes I'm imagining racist. Do you think the dynamic would have been even more toxic, for lack of a better term, if, let's say, they were talking to a white guy like me as opposed to a woman of color?
So you mean toxic as in between the researcher and the participant?
No, I mean their views, the honesty by which they share their views.
Yeah. So, okay. So I think yes and no, because with me though, what I also found is that they would start with being more apprehensive and, being a little bit reserved. But by the end of it, I had a lot of them that were very honest about they don't like these groups or they don't like other people. And I would be like, like, hello, I'm sitting right in front of you. But it was so weird that it's almost like they're talking to you, but they're telling you they don't like other people who are like you, but you're okay as a person, but just the group, other groups that they don't like. So I felt that I don't know, if the honesty was an issue, because I felt sometimes maybe if you're an outsider, they want to give you more information about who you are, right? Because they want to really prove themselves that this is who we are and this is who we are not. And over time, they were able to, remove some of that barriers and being more honest in their views. Because with Kathleen Blee, right? She is a white woman, and she was talking about, she thought that they would be more honest, but she also found that even she faced some criticism because they thought that they have this whole idea of white traitor, right? So somebody who is white but still is on the left or doesn't care about the race as much. So she felt that even though she was a white woman, she felt that a lot of them didn't trust her despite her being white because they thought she was a traitor to the race, right? So yeah, I don't know, theoretically it would make sense to me that they would be more honest with you. But I don't know how it will be like, actually in the field, because I'm assuming they would judge you more than on your skin color. They would look at what other things you believe in and, what exactly is your agenda with them and what have you written before, they obviously search you online before talking to you. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And we've chatted about this prior. It's just, it's one of those things I think it's always been on my mind. Like, would they be different? And, I guess we can't really know. Oh, we do have two more questions here. When do we get to read the dissertation? And why do you think your interviewees cared about whether they were perceived as racist? Were they not in fact racists, and proudly so?
Yeah, so I think for the first question, let's hope by next year. We are all hoping. I am hoping more than anybody else, because I am at that point where I am like, I just want to be done with it. It's been 7 years. Yeah, so hopefully by next year, my goal is to get it done and defend it. For the second one, I think the reason that they want to prove that they're not racist, I think, to be honest, they themselves don't believe themselves to be racist, right? So there's this idea of like, for them, they don't understand the concept of structural racism or how racism can manifest in ideas as well. For them, racism is just that your skin color and how you look. So they will often say that just because you look different, it's not I hate you that you look different, right? I might not like you because of, some cultural things or some religious things, or because I see you as a competition in the job market or something like that, right? So I think in their mind, the conception of racism is very minute. It's that only do I hate you based on skin color or no? And as long as I don't hate you on skin color, I cannot be discriminatory at all. Because if you talk about anything like structural racism or white privilege, that's a big no-no, because, I'm a plumber. What white privilege do I have? No, I don't have any white privilege, and I don't support affirmative action. Just work hard and get it. I don't hate other people. Those kind of things they would say, because I think in their mind, they might actually think that, they are not racist only because they're okay with other skin colors. It's just that they don't like other groups for other reasons besides skin color.
Wow, it's interesting, the sort of mental gymnastics that's at work there. We're coming up to the end of our chat. Auden, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and the thorough answers you provided to many questions today. I think I speak on behalf of everyone that you are incredibly brave and courageous, and we're all very excited to read this dissertation, which will hopefully be out by next year. Fingers crossed. And thank you so much for your time, Auden.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Brandon, for moderating, and thank you for everyone in the audience for